Hello friends, you're back. I'm back. That can only mean one thing. It's time for another new episode of the Animal Nerd Podcast. I don't know why I opened this like some kind of kids' TV show. I'm so sorry. For those of you who are still listening and didn't immediately click off, hi, and welcome back to another episode of the Animal Nerd Podcast. Unless I've messed up my scheduling completely, this should be our third episode. And don't worry, I promise I'll stop counting them after this. I'm not going to be like, oh, welcome to our 182nd episode in however many years' time. Before we get into this episode though, I just want to say a massive thank you to everyone who has listened to and supported this show. Obviously, we're still very new and it's already done better than I ever could have hoped. And I am so incredibly grateful for every single person who has listened to it or shared it with people or left a nice comment or anything like that. Honestly, I never really expected anyone to listen to my silly little animal show, much less enjoy it, but people have been, and I just wanted to say a massive thank you to everyone who has supported the show in any way at all, even if it's just listening to it. I appreciate it more than I can say, and I'm so grateful for all of you. So if you are one of those people who has already been listening to the show or subscribing or anything like that, then thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. It really does mean the world to me. Which sounds so pathetic, I know, but it's true. I'm a pathetic human being. So this episode is going to be a little different from the last two, and I hope you don't mind too much. Most of the episodes in the series are going to be like the previous ones, focusing on telling the story of either an individual animal or a specific event. However, for this one, I thought we could maybe try something a little different. You know, it's good to keep things varied, to keep things interesting. So today, I'm going to be telling you about an entire species of animal who have one of the most mind-blowing adaptations I think I've ever heard of. But there's a lot more to these little creatures than a single impressive adaptation, don't you worry. Today, I want to share with you the incredible wood frog. Okay, so it's not an impressive name, and these little guys aren't all that impressive to look at either. You certainly wouldn't expect them to be interesting enough to make an entire podcast episode on. I mean, I think they're adorable, but then I think all frogs are adorable. Even turtle frogs, they're like absolute little gremlins. Like seriously, if you've never seen a picture of a turtle frog before, just pause the podcast and go and Google it. They're so weird and I love them so much. Wood frogs, on the other hand, are a lot less unique looking. They're medium-sized by frog standards, but still small to a human. They're these cute little light brown guys with a dramatic black mask pattern on their face, which kind of reminds me of a raccoon. Slightly cruel irony there, as raccoons are actually one of their natural predators. Although they're not quite as plain as they appear. You see, wood frogs have the ability to change colour. It's not super dramatic, it's not like what you might imagine with, say, a chameleon, but it's still impressive. And that's not even the adaptation I was going on about at the start of this episode. This is just like an extra little bonus thing they can do. When they're in the shade, they're a darker colour, but when they're out in the sun, their bodies change to become lighter, so they can better camouflage with their surroundings. At any given point, they can be any shade of brown, reddish, tan, grey, even greenish. Wood frogs live across North America, their range encompassing the northeast quarter of the US, southern Alaska, and much of Canada. They live further north than any other species of amphibian, encroaching far closer to the Arctic Circle than you'd expect from a cold-blooded animal. And that's what makes these guys so amazing. It's pretty obvious why other reptiles and amphibians don't live that far north, right? The winters would kill them. But that's the thing, they also kill the wood frog. When it starts to get cold, wood frogs start to bury themselves down in the soil and leaf litter of their forest homes. And if you're wondering, their woodland habitats are exactly where they get their names from. Underground, the frogs make these cute little hibernation chambers. And then it gets colder, and colder. And being cold-blooded, the wood frog's body temperature drops too, until they freeze. And I'm not being hyperbolic or metaphorical there. They literally, genuinely freeze, frozen solid like a block of ice. They stop breathing, their heart stops beating, all activity in their brain stops. From a medical standpoint, the frog is dead, and they stay there buried underground all winter, frozen and lifeless. But then the spring comes, the world around them begins to warm, and the wood frog's body begins to thaw. And when it does, instead of decomposing, it moves. It's alive. And once the frog has fully thawed out, they dig their way back up to the surface, and they head hundreds of meters down, to the same small vernal pool where they themselves were born, in search of a mate. As though literally dying for months and coming back to life is just no big deal to them. And to be fair, it's not. This happens every single winter to every single wood frog. Winter comes, they dig down into the leaf litter, freeze to a block of solid ice, and then eventually defrost and just go back to their lives as normal. But how? Under those kinds of circumstances, most animals would just freeze to death, and that would be that. That's why cold-blooded animals don't live that far north. Well, for that, we have to go back to autumn, before hibernation begins. As the seasons turn and the weather starts to get colder, the wood frogs migrate from their summer homes upland, seeking out areas that will remain moist throughout the winter, as, being amphibians, they can't risk drying out. And once they find the perfect place, wood frogs, driven by the genius of animal instinct, burrow down into the soft, damp leaf litter, creating a shallow depression that will be their home until spring. The leaf litter and moss down here will help keep them moist through the winter, and I'm genuinely sorry for how often I'm using the word moist in this episode. I know that's an ick for a lot of people, but it feels like moist is the most accurate term to use here. What can I say? Frogs are just moist creatures. As autumn continues to harden into winter above ground, the wood frog's body prepares itself for hibernation. They increase the amount of glucose and urea in their cells. This helps stave off dehydration, but more importantly than that, these are natural cryoprotectants. I'd never heard of the word cryoprotectant before researching for this episode, and for those of you who are as confused as I was about it, a cryoprotectant is a substance that protects biological tissue from damage caused by freezing and ice. It's basically antifreeze, that's probably the best way to think of it. And this natural antifreeze means that no matter how cold it gets, ice cannot form in any of the wood frog's cells. And this is how they survive the cold. If their cells were to freeze, they'd die. And yet, as I mentioned earlier, these frogs do freeze solid over winter, so how does that happen? Well, you see, although ice can't form in their cells, ice crystals do form in the space between the cells, but they're confined just to these tiny spaces, and thanks to the cryoprotectants, no damage is done to the frog's tissues. Their blood, their vital organs are all completely unharmed. As the wood frog freezes, their breathing and heart rate slow down until they're non-existent. The wood frog will remain like this all winter. In total, they can survive for up to 7 months in this frozen state. And, like I said earlier, once the weather begins to warm, they thaw out. The ice between their cells melts away, the frogs wake up from their stupor, their body begins to work as normal again, and they dig their way up to the surface and return to their breeding grounds. It's very important that wood frogs get to their breeding grounds and start mating as early in the year as possible, because they lay their eggs in what are known as vernal pools, or ephemeral pools. These are a kind of wetland habitat. They're temporary, seasonal pools that are created by snowmelt and rain. They're ideal for tadpoles to develop in because their temporary nature means they're free from predatory fish who would otherwise love to feast on the frog's babies. However, the temporary nature of these pools is a double-edged sword, because while they contain fewer predators than a permanent body of water, the fact that these pools are only temporary also means that at some point in the summer, the water will evaporate, and they'll dry up completely. And if there are any tadpoles still living there when that happens, well, they won't be for long. This is why wood frogs try to breed as early in the year as they can, so that their offspring have as long as possible to try and develop into terrestrial frogs before the water dries up. Although vernal pools are temporary, they still form in the same place each year, and the vast majority of wood frogs will seek out the specific pool that they themselves hatched out in years before to lay their own eggs in once they reach maturity. The annual mating ritual begins when the males of the species give off a distinctive duck-like quacking sound as they swim about in the pools looking for females. Female frogs tend to stay underwater a lot of the time, until they feel ready to mate, because the males of the species are, to be honest, not what you might call gentlemen. The female frogs will choose their favourite male based on his quacking, deciding which one sounds like it has the best genes to pass on to her offspring. Despite the fact that the males are actively out seeking females, they're not actually the best at finding them. You see, male wood frogs apparently can only recognise a female of their species by touch, not by sight or smell. The only way the males can identify a female is by jumping onto their back and hugging them in an embrace known as emplexus. The females feel bulkier than the males because they have over 1,000 eggs inside them more or less ready to be laid. And obviously this means plenty of males jumping onto other males only to be disappointed. And honestly, even just jumping onto another male is more than some males manage. They get into such a mating frenzy at this time of year that some of them will jump onto basically anything that moves to try and perform amplexus on them, including other species of frogs, toads, salamanders, just anything with a pulse really. It's not unheard of for wood frogs to basically form these chains, with one female at the front with a male holding onto her, and then a row of all males behind him clinging onto each other, like some kind of weird conga line. Yeah, wood frog mating season is wild, and frankly, this episode has contained more discussion of frog sex than I think any of us want, so let's move on. The females will lay their eggs in these pools, which are immediately fertilised by the males, or male, whichever lucky guy made it at the front of the conga line. The eggs will then swell up and form a gelatinous mass which floats on the surface of the water. Each individual female can lay over 1,000 eggs, and females will often lay their eggs in the same raft as others, resulting in these massive floating islands of thousands and thousands of eggs. This is another reason why the frogs are so motivated to try and lay their eggs as early as possible. The first eggs laid are in the middle of the raft, which not only keeps them safer from predators, who will typically go for the eggs on the edges, but the centre also tends to have the best temperature for rapid development. It takes between 1 and 3 weeks for the eggs to hatch, with the length of time varying based on the temperature. When they do hatch, they emerge as tiny black or dark brown tadpoles, only 1/4 of an inch long. That's barely half a centimetre. Although during their development they can reach more than 6 centimetres before they develop into froglets. The tadpoles are mostly herbivorous, feeding on algae and whatever decaying plant matter they might find, although they will absolutely eat the eggs and larvae of amphibians if they find them, including other wood frog tadpoles and eggs. And when they're not being cannibalised by each other, wood frog tadpoles are also predated on by various other creatures that call these vernal pools their homes. Although the whole reason female frogs choose to lay in vernal pools rather than permanent lakes or rivers is to avoid fish, there are still plenty of other predators lurking in the depths, including salamanders, turtles, adult frogs, even beetles. Nature is brutal. All of these dangers mean that the tadpoles have evolved to be fast swimmers. And not only that, they can learn to detect and thus avoid predators based on their scents, but only if they encounter that predator's scent intermingled with the scent of an injured tadpole. It's documented that once they recognise a predator's scent, they stop moving to try and avoid detection. And yet it's also been found that if they smell too much of a predator before they hatch, they'll actually be far less likely to perceive these creatures as threats once they do hatch, which is obviously an issue. One thing about wood frog tadpoles that I really love is that it's been found that they're actually able to recognise their own siblings, and not only that, but they'll also seek each other out and then stick together in little sibling groups for safety, which I think is just adorable. It's actually believed that wood frogs may be the best at recognising their own family members of any amphibian species, just another thing that makes them really cool. If the tadpoles can survive the gauntlet of predators and find enough food of their own, which may or may not involve being the predator that catches other tadpoles, they will, of course, develop into froglets and then juvenile frogs. As well as the availability of food, the length of time it takes is also determined by population density and temperature, with the whole process from tadpole to frog taking anywhere between 7 and 18 weeks. As the pools dry up in summer, the new young frogs will spend their time in the swamps, ravines, bogs and woodland that their species call home, until the time comes for them to migrate upland for their first ever hibernation and deep freeze. I find it so incredible that animals know how to do this kind of thing just by instinct. Even with no one there to teach them, they still know where to go, what to do. They really put humans to shame. Although wood frogs do gather together in large numbers during the mating season, outside of that, they're broadly solitary, and the young frogs won't be ready to join the annual mating frenzy for years. Typically, females will reach sexual maturity between the ages of 3 and 6, and males between 2 and 4, with frogs from the northerly populations maturing slower at the latter end of that range. The average lifespan for most wild wood frogs, though, is only 4 to 5 years, meaning that many will only be able to mate once in their lifetimes. So it's no wonder then that the females lay so many eggs at once, and that the males get so carried away. Although some frogs have been documented as living longer than that even in the wild, with the oldest lifespan for a wild male being 8 years and 10 for a female, so some do get lucky. Wood frogs serve an important role in the ecosystem. They feast on a variety of species, including insects, arachnids, slugs, and snails, and they themselves also provide an important food source for a variety of larger predators, including raccoons, snakes, birds, skunks, mink, and other larger species of frog. Wood frogs do have one main defense mechanism to try and keep themselves safe from predators, though, and that's special glands on their skin that allow them to secrete a poisonous toxin. While this isn't dangerous to humans, it could potentially be fatal to a predator if ingested. Plus, they will scream to defend themselves if they have to. They also have nearly 360-degree vision to help them spot potential threats, the result not only of the position of their eyes, but also their horizontal pupils. In 2013, a 13-year-old school student from New York State decided to write to a senator to suggest making the wood frog the state's official amphibian. They didn't have one at the time, even though neighbouring states did, and although it took 5 years, eventually New York did indeed pass a bill to make the wood frog the state's official amphibian. And I love that. I think they're definitely a species that deserve more love when you consider what incredible little animals they are. In fact, the wood frog's ability to freeze and thaw has been studied extensively by scientists, who are hoping that a better understanding of how they do what they do could be used to help humans. One particularly exciting area of study is the potential to be able to freeze donated human organs before thawing them out for transplants, which isn't possible currently, but which could save a lot of lives if the technology and the science ever gets there. In the future, there could be people out there who are only alive because of the unassuming little wood frog. So, wood frogs have the potential to save people's lives. That's pretty incredible, but let's flip the script. What kind of impact are we as a species having on them? Well, wood frogs are listed by the ICUN as least concern. This is the best possible classification a species can have, as it means that they're not currently thought to be at risk of extinction or becoming endangered. However, that doesn't mean that wood frogs aren't being negatively impacted by human activity. Deforestation and urbanisation are not only destroying their homes, but also leading to habitat and population fragmentation, which makes it hard for different populations of frogs to interconnect, breed and survive. And of course there are also the threats that roads pose to these frogs, who can travel thousands of metres between their breeding grounds, summer habitat and overwintering locations. And of course there's climate change, which is affecting all life on Earth, and wood frogs are no exception to that. Unstable and unpredictable weather patterns caused by climate change pose a large threat to the delicate natural balance that these frogs and so many other species rely on to survive. And then there's another risk that wood frogs are facing which harms them before they even become frogs, and that's the pollution of the freshwater ecosystems on which they rely. There are many sources of this pollution: industrial chemicals, fertilizers, pesticides, but perhaps one of the most dangerous is the salt used to de-ice roads in wintertime. It's been documented that road salts disrupt the tadpoles' development and survival rates in all sorts of ways, and also cause them to develop abnormalities, which may affect their ability to survive or breed further down the line. It's a complex topic, especially with road salts, because it's not as though we can just stop gritting the roads in winter. But clearly there's a need for innovation to create a sustainable alternative to road salts that's as safe for nature as it is for drivers. And you guys know me. I don't think it's helpful for discussion around climate change and conservation to be all doom and gloom. Of course, we shouldn't be ignoring the danger that climate change poses to both human and animal life, but focusing only on the negative and scary side of things doesn't really help. It just leads to eco-anxiety and climate doomerism, neither of which are helpful in the fight to save the planet. The key to fighting climate change is education and empowerment. And I'm hoping that this episode, this podcast, can play a tiny part in the education side of things. The more we learn and share about the dangers posed to species like the wood frog, the more we can do about it. I know it's a cliche, but knowledge really is power. For example, the damage that road salts do to wood frogs and a plethora of other species is awful. But thanks to the scientists who dedicate their lives and careers to studying this kind of thing, we know that it's happening, and that's a good thing. It means we can look into more eco-friendly alternatives and put pressure on those responsible for gritting the roads to make positive changes. There are so many people out there doing all they can to help fight climate change, and I'm willing to bet that if you love animals enough to be listening to this podcast, then you probably are too. So on behalf of wood frogs and every species that calls this beautiful planet their home, I want to say thank you. Thank you for caring and fighting and educating yourself and spreading the word. People like you are the ones who are changing the world and making it a better, safer place each and every day. People like you are the ones driving change and creating the hope that we all need. So again, thank you. And thank you for listening to this podcast. So since this episode is a little shorter than normal, I thought I'd maybe take a minute to talk to you guys about something. That makes it sound really serious. It's not, don't worry. But recently I've been thinking, because sometimes I do that, and currently this podcast doesn't make any money, which is obviously not surprising given that this is only my 3rd episode. And also this is kind of a niche show, I guess. But I've been thinking about the fact that it potentially one day could. And there's an animal sanctuary called the Little Rescue Zoo. They're a really small sanctuary, so I don't imagine you'll ever have heard of them unless you listen to this podcast through YouTube, because the show is hosted on their channel, or unless you know the people who run it, which is the case with me. I'm not able to volunteer there physically because of some of the health issues that I have, but I still really believe in their work and want to support them. And I've been doing that for a while with helping create online content for them. If you've watched any of the videos on their YouTube channel, you probably recognise my voice. And although I started this podcast as a passion project, I realised pretty early on that it could potentially be like another way of digitally volunteering, a way that I can support them and their work even if I can't really do anything in person. Like, obviously I want to be able to let people know about them, and this podcast is potentially a way to do that, but mostly I was thinking that if I ever am able to make money through this podcast, then I would really love to be able to donate all of it to the sanctuary. Obviously, rescuing animals is expensive, especially when most of the animals you take in are either exotic pets with specific heating, lighting and dietary requirements, or animals who have chronic health issues or disabilities that require additional care. And those are the 2 areas that the Little Rescue Zoo specialises in. And I thought this might be a nice way to help out with that. Especially as it's free to listen to this podcast. It costs you nothing, but just by listening to this show, you can help raise money to save animals' lives. I think that's really cool. I mean, theoretically you can help raise money for free. This podcast isn't making anything yet. But the only way that it's ever going to be able to start earning is by increasing the number of people listening. So if you would like to join me in supporting this incredible animal rescue organisation, then please do anything you can to support the show. Whether that's subscribing and listening in every week, giving us a positive review or rating, sharing it with anyone you think would enjoy it, and if you're listening to this via YouTube, leaving a comment and liking the video. Both of those things really encourage the algorithm to push it out to more people. And actually, the reason this podcast YouTube home is on the Little Rescue Zoo's own channel is to help us be able to raise more money quicker. I mean, their channel isn't monetized yet, but it's closer to being able to be than a new channel would be, and so it made sense to put it up there rather than creating a new one just for the show. Plus, once it is monetized, it means any money made through the channel will go directly to the sanctuary rather than to me, so it cuts out the middleman. And you're safe in the knowledge that I'm not pocketing any of it on the way, which I like to think you'd be able to trust me enough not to do that anyway, but just in case. But yeah, I thought I'd mention that because I haven't yet, but I really wanted to. I wasn't entirely sure how to tie it into an episode outro when it has nothing to do with the episode's content beyond just animals, so I realised that the best way to do it was just to bring it up rather than trying to create some kind of segue or whatever. And yeah, I think that's kind of all I have to say for now. Thank you again for listening to this week's episode. I know it might be a bit different, but we will be returning to our regularly scheduled programming next week, and I'm really excited about the next episode. It's about an animal who I absolutely loved as a child, and I'm really excited to share it with you, especially as she's an animal who has been kind of forgotten by a lot of people, I think. That episode has also been kind of a beast to research. Like the Clever Hands one, it also involved having to read a whole book just for the episode, which is why I needed a shorter episode this week in between 2 much more research-intensive ones. But you'll have to wait till Tuesday to find out who the animal is. But in the meantime, please let me know what you thought of this one. Love it, hate it, overwhelmingly neutral towards it, let me know. As ever, all of our social media and contact info will be in the show notes if you want to reach out or follow us elsewhere. And if you haven't already and you'd like to, please subscribe to the Animal Nerd podcast on whatever platform you use. I bring out a brand new episode every single Tuesday, and I'm going to stop bothering you now because I feel like I've been rambling for ages. And yeah, thank you again for joining me today, and I will see you next Tuesday. Stay wild, friends!